period of 1945-1964. It is the aftermath of World War II. Malta is devastated, and the British Empire is pretty much falling apart politically. And also, you realize that the 1950s and 60s is now a new age, a new time, which then the political scenario of the Mediterranean is again going to change, which we see the results of it even today. So obviously, with the announcement of the victory of the war, there is jubilation all around the world. I mean, in the Western world at least.
From number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister makes the momentous announcement for which the world had been waiting.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The injuries she has inflicted upon Great Britain, the United States, and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King!
Of course, the reality of after World War II is a serious different story. And from it, the outcome is what then connects with module number 3, the idea of human rights, the Universal Human Rights Declaration. But that we will approach and tackle in task number 3, and which you also, if you've already started on task 3, you'll see the questions relating to it.
The horrors of the Second World War are etched into the imagination of public discourse. But what of its aftermath? How does a continent at war for 6 years and unstable for much longer create peace when so many national, ideological, and social resentments remain? It's easy to forget that a military victory for the Allies didn't mean that a defeated people's attitudes and ideologies suddenly changed. And World War II was not just a military conflict. So many in Europe let their resentment be unleashed on their ideological or ethnic enemies, whether from the same state or not. To think then that the end of the war means the end of resentment is naive. In the Soviet Union, 70,000 villages and 1,700 towns were destroyed by the Nazis during the war, and 16 million people died, over 15% of its population. But when the Nazis were defeated and the Soviets occupied Berlin at the beginning of May 1945, retribution had already begun. In Vienna alone, which the Soviets had taken by the beginning of April, some 87,000 women were reported by doctors to have been raped by Soviet soldiers. In Berlin, the numbers were even higher. Throughout 1945, the citizens of Vienna lived on just 800 calories a day. It was already clear that the post-war period was going to be almost as horrific as the war, but in different and unexpected ways. Countries in Eastern Europe expelled all Germans living there and confiscated their property. But the defeat of the Nazis didn't mean anti-Semitism went away. Anti-Semitism wasn't a German phenomenon. It was a European and a global one. Between 1948 and 1951, 332,000 Jews emigrated to Israel. But when the horrors of anti-Semitism and fascism were at their height and France and much of Eastern Europe was under occupation, there was always some optimism. Most countries had some form of underground resistance. But personal indignation, ideological bitterness, and the psychology of submission to an invading oppressor, what the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre likened to the kind of sadomasochism of sexual submission, meant that incidents of neighbours reporting their own neighbours to the Nazis was disturbingly high. In the aftermath of the war, formerly occupied nations would ask themselves difficult questions. What did resistance mean, and what did collaboration mean? Retribution towards the Nazis through the Nuremberg trials is well known. But as governments busied themselves attempting to fix a broken and desperate Europe, people, communities, neighbours, they all wanted revenge. During occupation, some slept with Nazis, some worked with them, some welcomed them, some out of support, some out of destitution. The situation was not only difficult, it was, of course, desperate. When the revenge on these collaborators began after the war, it was merciless. In France, some 10,000 were killed in extrajudicial executions by bands of local resistors. In Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, many more were lynched and murdered. In Norway, 55,000 members of a pro-Nazi organisation were tried, and in the Netherlands, 100,000 were sent to prison. In Belgium, almost 3,000 were sentenced to death, but only 242 were carried out. Czechoslovakia sentenced 713 to death, 741 to life in prison, and almost 20,000 shorter sentences. Austria had 700,000 Nazi Party members in a country of only 7 million. Only 13,600 of them were sent to prison. In a country where Nazism was so entrenched, Austria had to distinguish between lower and higher Nazis so as not to tear the entire country apart. But it was the French that had complicated questions to ask. The state itself, Vichy France, collaborated with the Nazis as a puppet state. Vichy France deported 76,000 Jews to the extermination camps. But authors like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre edited, published, or contributed to underground resistance newspapers like Combat. One, maybe apocryphal story, tells of a German officer visiting Picasso's studio in Paris. Picasso offered him a postcard of Guernica, his famous painting of fascist bombing during the Spanish Civil War. "Did you do this?" the officer asked. "No, you did," Picasso replied. In France, as this infamous image taken by photojournalist Robert Capa shows, women's heads were shaved as punishment for having liaisons with the Nazis. This punishment has a long history in Europe, and the resistance threatened collaborators with it through the underground press. When a place was liberated, punishment was swift. Many were shorn in groups in public squares, then marched through the streets, stripped and marked with SWAT stickers. Around 20,000 women had their heads shaved in France. We can see why the historian Stanley Hoffman distinguishes between two types of collaboration. Collaboration for the benefit and survival of France and the French people, a practical and sometimes necessary collaboration, and collaborationism with Nazis in the sense of cooperation for personal gain or political affinity. The latter, of course, must be judged more harshly. One, though, can quickly turn to the other. This, of course, doesn't even begin to look at the question of how the Allies were to denazify Germany. In the city of Bonn, for example, 102 out of 112 doctors alone had been registered Nazi members. In 1946, 37% of Germans answered in a questionnaire yes, that the extermination of Jews and other non-Aryans was necessary for the security of Germans. In 1952, 25% of Germans still had a good opinion of Hitler. In all, 100,000 Germans were convicted across Europe, less than the total convictions for collaborations in other countries. So, with collaboration so widespread, as the historian Tony Judd has pointed out, the need for Europe to forget the extent of fascist sympathy quickly superseded the need for retaliation. By the end of the 1950s, there were hardly any Nazis remaining in prison across Europe at all. Sartre wrote of France that the whole country both resisted and collaborated. Everything we did was equivocal. We never quite knew whether we were doing right or wrong. A subtle poison corrupted even our best actions.
So when we look at the aftermath of World War II, you start to realize that the realization of what Europe experienced, what the world had experienced in the past 7 years, it was a shock to the system. Now, here in Malta, obviously, the British government looked into reconstructing Malta after the war, and they commissioned the War Damage Commission. So when we look at the overhaul, so the situation is this: the economy and politics of Malta post-World War II. You need to understand the Mediterranean politics and local politics. The church in Malta, the Commonwealth, Queen Elizabeth in Malta, and the emigration crisis. Mediterranean politics. All I have to mention is what's happening in Israel, Palestine, even today. But before World War II, the British Empire was responsible for Egypt, Israel, okay, that region. That is then passed on to the Americans. Local political scene. Here in Malta, there is a brief period where, because of the support of the British, the Maltese are pro-British. But then by 1950-55, the realization that the British government doesn't care about Maltese because they have serious other problems worldwide and their political views are elsewhere. Their political priorities are elsewhere. What happens here in Malta is that just enough food arrives so that the Maltese don't starve. But it was very difficult. There wasn't a lot of food. It was a period of rationing, having tickets and going to the shops and exchanging those goods. And people who had their own lands and could produce produce goods, etc., they were in a position of power because they could sell their items, all right, at a higher price. So you have the issue of inflation. Job security, okay, there is the commissioning of damage control, of rebuilding Malta. There's a lot of work there of restructuring Malta. But once that is completed, there is not much anything else. The naval shipyards produces work, yes, but again, those places are taken up. So when you start to look at the economy in the middle part of Malta and Gozo, there isn't much going on except for the basic construction of the island and agriculture. Manufacturing doesn't exist anywhere. And because of this, it even leads to, a serious division in society. Those who were doing business with the British were in business, were able to make good money, saw the British as, they put them on a pedestal. But the Maltese, who had no access to good economy, good work, then they were suffering a lot. And you see a divide between um, Maltese in association with the British, so Sliema, Hartard, Valletta, St. Andrews, St. Julian's, Birkirkara, Mostan Nashar, these areas. And then you have the southern parts, where, Zaytun, Hazabuj, Brizabuja, Zwi, Rendi, where they are suffering. And you start to see a divide between two groups of people in Malta, which today we even refer to them as Talpepe, English Maltese speaking, and Tassaut, Maltese. And this is where you see the divide between the football, those who are pro-Italian culture, because obviously after World War II, the fact that the Italians bombed Malta, they missed, but, we didn't hold that against them, because Italians by the 50s and 60s were producing beautiful culture on TV, beautiful music, fantastic cuisine. So there's that association with Italy. Whereas with the British, it was more a question of education, power, politics, business, and the idea that if you spoke English, you were upper class. So you have this divide, Tal Pepe or Tas South, which still exists in our society today. Let me tell you how funny it is. For example, I remember in the 90s when mobile phone companies started up and we had mobile technology in Malta. Back then, I think it was 3G. You had two major companies, Vodafone, which today is Epic, and Go. So the simple reasoning was this: Vodafone, Tal Pepe; Go, Tas South. You own a car. Bena. People from the south drive a BMW. People who are English speaking, Tal Pepe, Mercedes. I mean, it's ridiculous, but these mentalities still exist today. And you can hear it in the pronunciation of the English. And there are schools in Malta that did not even teach Maltese, only English. Okay? So you have this social divide happening in the 50s and 60s. Out of World War II, because of the significance of the religion and the church, death, threats, you could die any moment, the church gained more popularity and power. But then in the 50s and 60s, it also had political power. The British realized that if they gave power to a religious order, in the case in Malta, the church, this meant that through the church, they could control the people through fear. And this is what happened between the Order of St. John kept the church in power because they too were a religious order. With the French, the power of the church was totally abolished with of the aristocrats. But the British, for marketing propaganda's sake and controlling the people, brought in the church to, and through lack of education, not providing opportunities in the 1800s onwards. Don't forget, the French brought in education, but the British stopped that. Education was then provided in 1879, in the 1870s. So what you see is manipulation of controlling the people by keeping them ignorant, uneducated, and through the fear of God. And that reached a peak, of course, during World War II, and then in the 50s and 60s, it came to a position where my father tells me these stories, my mother too. When you were walking in the street, if you came across and you met a priest or a higher up priest, a bishop, you had to kneel, do a curtsy, and they will put out their hand and kiss their ring. And if you wanted to travel abroad and have a passport, you had to get permission from the church. That's how absurd the 50s and 60s was. In fact, the church even intervened in local politics, to the point that if you voted Labour, you would be put in a part of the cemetery, making sure that your soul went to hell. Okay? They called it the rubbish tip, the il-mizbla. This is how absurd and ridiculous politics gets in the 50s and 60s. So you have a political divide. The those in favor of the British and those who are against. Now, the Labour Party in the 50s and 60s, in the 50s, actually wanted full integration with Britain, with England, so that Maltese citizens became British, equal rights, equal terms, self-governing in Malta, responding to the capital in England. Pretty much what the French had offered in 1798. And then they blew it up in 1799 by stealing things from the church. But you see how history repeats itself, how funny politics, when an ideology benefits us, we're all for it, but when it doesn't, we're all against it. So this is the scenario of 1950s and 1960s. Limited food, or food available to those who could afford it. Who can afford it? Those are in line with the British influence, business, commerce, middle class up. So in other words, you're making good money, you can send your children to school. If not, then your children probably go to school to the age of 10 or 11, 12 at the most, and then they have to go and help with the family. The boys go and work, and the girls stay home to help with the family. Because, families back then were like 5, 10, sometimes even 15 children. So you have all these issues. Social reform doesn't exist. Social security doesn't exist. Medical health care, it's okay. All right? It's okay. Manufacturing industries, nothing. Tourism doesn't exist. Areas of Malta, Maltese are not allowed to enter because they are British owned. This is 1950s, 1960s. All right? Coming out of it also, you have the Commonwealth, which is run and created by Queen Elizabeth II. And Queen Elizabeth in the 50s and 60s, she actually lived in Malta. In the TV series, again, pop culture, episode 1, The Crown, there's a scenario where you see her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, taking part in the regatta of Malta. And also Queen Elizabeth with her children in their villa. So that is the positive side of the British. So again, if you're making money from the British, fantastic. If you're not, many struggles. Which led to the emigration crisis. Late 50s and 60s, practically 1/3 of the population of Malta had no choice but to leave. Some went to London, some went to Canada, some went to Australia. Well, a lot of them went to Australia and they set up 2 communities, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney, or in the region of Sydney. I'm coming from the region of Sydney, basically, the Maltese community there. In fact, the immigration crisis got so bad that so many houses were left empty that the government stated that if a property remains empty for over a period of time and they don't claim it, the government will take it back. It was a fear factor to try and bring people back in. And if you look at what's happening in Eastern European countries, you'll see that governments are doing everything to bring their nationals back into their countries as well. So you start again. This is why you learn history, because you can start to see the patterns and then you can understand what's next. So that's what's going on there. Reconstruction, agriculture, the shipyard, military spending, local product manufacturing, tourism. These are all the main topics coming out from the economies and political situation of Malta post-World War II. So again, it depends on which side you are. If you're making money, living healthy, hey, if England plays football and wins, you are happy. If, on the other hand, you're suffering, then probably you're siding with Italian football. Again, elements you see today.
At London Airport, another reunion looms ahead as Princess Elizabeth arrives to fly to Malta. Told by Sir John Dalbiac planes are grounded owing to fog, the Princess passes 2 hours playing canasta. Then comes the all clear, and she leaves to board her plane, a Viking of the King's flight. The Princess made a slow recovery after the birth of Princess Anne, and everyone wishes her bon voyage as her plane heads through the fog, bound for Malta's health-giving sunshine.
So, one of the positive legacies of Aftermath, Queen Elizabeth, Commonwealth, her time in Malta. Because the truth is this, history, when you look at it, it has its brutal moments. There are situations, but what makes us human. It's what societies is all about. So Queen Elizabeth, when she's young, and the Maltese traditional faldetta, here with on top right with George Borg Oliver, the first Maltese Prime Minister, and then bottom left and right you have the Queen Elizabeth sitting next to the Prime Minister of Malta, 2009-2013, Lawrence Gonzi. This is when CHOGM was held in Malta. In fact, the Commonwealth has held its meetings in Malta about 2 or 3 times in the last 20 years. So for the Queen, Malta has always had a special place in her heart because this is where she had her fondest memories as a princess with no worries in the world, starting a family before she became queen. So what is the Commonwealth?
The Commonwealth is a collection of 54 countries that are home to 2.5 billion people. That's almost a third of the world. That total also includes 19 African countries. It's a young organisation. 60% of the Commonwealth population is under the age of 30. The modern Commonwealth was formed in 1949, although at that time it had 8 members, and only one, South Africa, was on the continent. Initially, all members of the Commonwealth were former British colonies. Mozambique was the first country without a British colonial past to join in 1995, followed by Rwanda in 2009. The Commonwealth says to join you need to share the values of the Commonwealth Charter, adopted in 2012. These include democracy, human rights and the rule of law. So what happens when a country is accused of breaking these commitments? South Africa removed itself in 1964 after pressure from member states about its racist apartheid policies and only rejoined in 1994. Other countries to have left and then come back include Nigeria and Gambia. Zimbabwe withdrew in 2003 for breaking the Commonwealth Charter under former President Robert Mugabe and have yet to be readmitted. Supporters say it helps countries to develop and work together on international goals. Some say, though, that it's a legacy of Britain's colonial past and doesn't have any power. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex, that's Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, said in July that the Commonwealth must acknowledge its past, even if it's uncomfortable. The head of the Commonwealth is Harry's grandma, Queen Elizabeth II. The organisation is led day by day by the Secretary-General. She is currently Patricia Scotland, its first female head. We'll meet her in a moment. The Commonwealth meets every 2 years to discuss their plans. They were meant to meet in Rwanda in 2020, but this has been delayed due to the pandemic. You might also have heard of the Commonwealth Games. This is a massive sporting event that takes place every 4 years, featuring athletes from all the Commonwealth countries.
So that video is about 5 years old, so some of the information is outdated with, Harry and Meghan, but you get the idea. In fact, in the final scene, where is it?
Moment.
No,
We'll meet her.
please be quiet. Which one? This one here. You can see on top right, CHOGM Malta 2015. So here's the situation in Malta. Following World War II, there was a debate between the Maltese political class and the people of Malta on the future of the country. Following a referendum, the Maltese decided that they should be an independent country, with the Maltese government which decided on all matters, and with the Queen of the United Kingdom as the most symbolic head of the state as the Queen of Malta. So this created a political situation, which, as you can see here, the BBC declares it as the problem of Malta. What the British were afraid of is that if Malta breaks away, this will become a habit, influencing other countries as well.
you remember this? Do you remember the years when the little island of Malta stood alone in the Mediterranean, one of the smallest but most essential links in the chain of Allied defense and attack? Often her guns were down to the last few rounds. A handful of fighter planes were draining their last gallons of petrol. Her people tightening their belts to the last notch and beyond. But still, the George Cross Islands stood firm. Still, the convoys battled their way through to Malta's Grand Harbour. Had Malta fallen, there might have been no Mediterranean convoys at all. And what that would have meant, no one dares to think. The war is over, but Malta's problems are not. And to England, to plead her cause, come the Maltese cabinet, led by 38-year-old Prime Minister Dom Mintoff. They bring a novel request, that Malta should become part of Great Britain, represented in her parliament and sharing her social services. Malta's contribution to British strength in war and peace, her leaders claim, as well as her ancient civilization and practical experience of government, would entitle her to dominion status if she were larger. In fact, she held a similar status under the Roman Empire. So Mr. Mintoff presents his plan to Downing Street. Seated with his Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Cole, Mr. Dom Mintoff sums up his plan.
The people of Malta have voted at the last general election, barely 4 months ago, for union with Britain. Such a union would guarantee their progress to the British standard of living, education, and social services. In return, they offer you, the people of Britain, a base as your own in the Mediterranean. They expect to have a say in our joint destiny by sending representatives to the House of Commons. Of course, they are willing to share all your risks and burdens. That we are capable of doing so has been shown clearly during the last 2 wars.
Mr. Mintoff's plan is new and strange, but accept it or not, we should do something for the island which did so much for us.
The year is 1956, and following a vote in favour of full integration with the UK, the Maltese Prime Minister at the time, Dom Mintoff, made this statement from 10 Downing Street, explaining the Maltese vote to the British population.
The people of Malta have voted at the last general election, barely 4 months ago, for union with Britain. Such a union would guarantee their progress to the British standard of living, education, and social services. In return, they offer you, the people of Britain, a base as your own in the Mediterranean.
However, this plan never came into fruition. And one begs the question, why did Malta never integrate with the UK? World War II left a devastating effect on the Maltese islands. Italian influence on the Maltese population was diminishing. As it turns out, bomb dropping is not an effective foreign relations strategy. The post-war recovery in Malta was slow. In December of 1955, the British government agreed that Malta would be allowed to physically form part of the UK, meaning that 1. The island would be allocated 3 seats in the British Parliament. 2. The Home Office would take over responsibility for Maltese affairs from the Colonial Office. 3. The Maltese Parliament would retain responsibility over all affairs except defence, foreign policy, and taxation. And 4. The Maltese were to obtain economic equivalence with their British counterparts. These conditions were put to vote in Malta in February of 1956. Prime Minister Mintoff wanted full integration with the British Empire, as this would have meant that the Maltese would enjoy equal social and economic standing with British citizens. George Bourges-Olivier and his Nationalist Party wanted Malta to enjoy the same Dominion status shared by Canada, Australia and New Zealand, with the Queen remaining the head of state. Integration would have meant new obligations for Malta in areas of taxation and conscription. the Nationalist Party pointed out that Malta becoming part of Britain would have resulted in the loss of its character, history, culture, and ethnicity, which had survived hundreds of years of colonization. The Maltese Catholic Church, led by Archbishop Gonzi, was also very skeptical of the proposal, fearing that the church would lose its position of high privilege and influence in Malta and become secondary to the Anglican Church. Results for the 1956 referendum showed that nearly 75% of the votes cast were in favour of integration. However, the Nationalist Party had boycotted the referendum. You see, the referendum question did not include their Dominion status proposal. The boycott meant that voter turnout stood at 60%, meaning that only 44% of the total Maltese electorate had actually voted for integration. Meanwhile, seeing what was going on in Malta, the British Parliament started getting cold feet. They did not want Malta to set a precedent for the other colonies. In addition, helping the Maltese achieve the economic equivalence would have cost the British government £10 million every year, or €280 million in today's money. In July of 1956, an Anglo-French naval operation left from Malta to retake the Suez Canal. Operation Musketeer was met with international condemnation, and Britain, faced with a strong Egyptian resistance on the ground and diplomatic pressure from overseas, was forced to accept a ceasefire. The failure of this operation highlighted the reduced importance of a British military presence in the Mediterranean. This fundamental change in foreign policy proved to be the final nail in the coffin for the integration experiment. As the Maltese Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Gisela Mercer, put it, whereas the British economy is not based on defence, in Malta, reductions in defence expenditure attack the very foundations of the island's whole economy. Mintoff did not react well to the British government backing up on its commitment to retain Malta as a military stronghold.
أنا في الكابينت ديشيدينا اللي دي العقدة مع إنجلترا نسوا darba l-dejma għax irridu nafu bi aktar, ma rridux nitkellmu fuq aktar. Aħna il-propju tagħna kellna jew għaqda jew indipendenza, aħna rridu l-indipendenza. U għaddiju għaqda mal-Ingilterra.
Increasingly bitter disputes and the differing expectations towards the integration experiment were central to its ultimate failure. Mintoff's determination to achieve equivalence clashed with the British government's reluctance to make the necessary financial commitment. Malta would later go on to follow a path to full independence, forever consigning the integration experiment to the history books.
So once the decision was made, both political parties pushed on to gain total independence from the British. Okay, which brings us to this era here. 21st September 1964, Independence Day. Of course, 21st September is a public holiday in Malta, and it's the day where finally Malta is governed by the Maltese.
An island, for its size perhaps the most famous in the world, occupying a glorious place in history, Malta. RAF Shackletons escort the Duke of Edinburgh flying in to land over Grand Harbour. For this is no ordinary day in the George Cross Island. Malta is achieving independence, and there in her honour are warships of all the NATO fleets. No stranger to men of war is this stout fortress, so long a base of the Mediterranean fleet, closely united in peace and war with Great Britain. This is the island that little more than 20 years ago withstood the greatest siege, judged by intensity, in all history. The daily target of a sustained air attack unlike anything the world had hitherto conceived to be possible. Somehow its gallant population of more than 300,000, crowded upon their tiny homeland, survived that terrifying rain of fire. Salute now the arrival of Prince Philip, coming to represent the Queen. Archbishop Gonzi, Premier Borg Olivia, and the Governor were on the airfield to welcome him. And first to greet His Royal Highness was the Governor, Sir Maurice Dorman. Leaving the airport, the Duke had a truly royal reception as he drove to the palace. Much treasured here is the tribute paid to Malta for her wartime bravery, the George Cross, presented to the island by King George VI. The wartime unity of the people has not survived the test of peace. The Labour Party demonstrated against the terms of independence, maintaining that they will make Malta a vassal of Britain and leave her powerless to withstand the political influence of the Roman Catholic Church. But in the majority of the people, there was a carnival spirit with no hint of dissatisfaction. One of the floats represented the George Cross. Commonwealth Minister Duncan Sands, with the Premier, awaited the Duke, who has officiated at other independence celebrations. With that sense of humour, which distinguishes him from most royal personages in their official duties, he once said to a newly independent Prime Minister, "I suppose you wouldn't care to change your mind?" Prince Philip now drove to an important part of the proceedings, held before the eyes of several thousand people, the handing over of the constitutional instruments. He had already conveyed to the Prime Minister and people a message from the Queen. Her Majesty warmly welcomed Malta as a free member of the Commonwealth. She hoped that the friendship and respect existing between Britain and Malta would grow and flourish. Dr. Borg Olivia proudly received the constitutional instruments and displayed them to the people. Near midnight, the new flag of independent Malta was to be unfurled with full ceremonial. A 164 years ago, the British flag was first hoisted in Malta in the Napoleonic Wars. Now it is lowered by an officer of the Royal Sussex Regiment, the regiment that raised the flag in 1800. So ends a chapter, a proud chapter, the direct rule of the island by the British. And so begins a new era, Malta independent, 19th member of the British Commonwealth.
Now, between independence of 1964 and December 1974, Malta always had the Queen as its head of state. But on 13 December, which is also a public holiday, Malta became a republic, meaning that we had a Maltese appointed as a president. And the first president of the republic was Sir Anthony Marmol, who had served as governor for the preceding years. So, of course, Independence Day and Republic Day are both celebrated in Malta.
Republic Day is marked by various ceremonies, gatherings, and celebrations throughout the country. And the main celebration is usually held in its capital, Valletta. And the presidential palace hosts most of the ceremonies. And fireworks also adorn the sky on this historic day.
Malta celebrates the principles of democracy, freedom, and unification on Republic Day, which serve as the cornerstones of the Maltese Republic and functions as a reminder of the country's path towards independence and self-governance.
Now, another historical day is 31st of March, 19. Why is this historical? Well, on that day, 31st March 1979, is actually when finally the British Army and Navy leaves the island, meaning in 1979 onwards, areas in St. Julian's, Baharicha, Pembroke, St. Andrews, White Rocks, Salina, all this area became open finally for the Maltese as well. So you need to understand, although we had independence in 1964, it is in 1979 that we finally have access to the full country. So 31st March, 21st September, 13th December, these 3 days are 3 public holidays associated with Malta independent, Malta governed by the Maltese. So when you think about the struggles from the 1600s, 1700s, through the French and through the British, it has been a long journey.
By the center, march!
So now we're going to start looking at the Maltese political system and understand the society will live.
Who knows all the countries in the world or even knows the basics about all these countries? In this small series, I would therefore like to give you an overview of those countries of the world, and this includes a brief overview of the most important data on their political system. And today it is about Malta. The official name of the country is Republic of Malta or Repubblica ta Malta. Form of government is a parliamentary democracy. The head of state is Dr. George Vella, President of the Republic of Malta, appointed on April 4th in 2019. The representative of the head of state is Dolores Cristina. She's acting president, appointed in 2013. The appointment is made by the Prime Minister after consulting the opposition leader. That's Article 49 of the Constitution. And the head of government is Dr. Robert Abela, the Prime Minister, appointed on January 13th in 2020 from the Partit Laburista, the PL, that's the Labour Party of Malta. The Foreign Minister is Evarist Bartolo, appointed on January 15th in 2020, also from the PL. On the Human Development Index, Malta ranks 29th place. Malta is a parliamentary democracy with a unicameral parliament, the House of Representatives, with 65 members elected for 5 years. Due to the compensation of overhanging mandates, there are currently 67 parliamentary seats. There is a two-party system. The Social Democratic Partit Laborista, the PL, has been in power since March 2013. The PL replaced the Christian Democratic Partit Nacionalista, the PN, which had ruled since 1998. The voter turnout is regularly over 90% even without voting. The archipelago in the Mediterranean consists of Malta, Gozo, and Comino, is about 90 kilometers south of Sicily, 320 kilometers east of Tunisia, and 350 kilometers north of Tripoli. Malta has a population of 500,000. With an area of 316 square kilometers, Malta is the smallest member state of the EU, which almost 1,600 inhabitants per kilometer. Malta has the highest population density in the EU. More than 90% of the Maltese belong to the Roman Catholic Church. Malta has a central administration. There are also 68 municipal administrations. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to my channel. Auf Wiedersehen.
So, of course, the video is outdated, but it gives you an overview of the current situation we have in Malta. Now, I've been telling you about how North and South, how Nationalist and Labour South explained. This video is going to show you and go into detail.
On November 30th, 1986, opposition leader Edi Fenekadami marched the Nationalist Party towards a mass meeting in Zaytoun. This was a controversial move, even considered provocative, as nationalist meetings in Labour Party fortress Zaytoun was at the time seen as taboo. The nationalist equivalent of Zaytoun is arguably Slima, with the Labour Party yet to hold a single mass meeting in this long-standing PM stronghold. Why is Malta divided along what appears to be a Labour South and a Nationalist North? Understanding how these voters became tied to the two parties and their migration patterns across the island is key to understanding these local political allegiances. In its early days, the Labour Party sought to secure stable employment for dry dock and civil service workers. It did this by strengthening ties with the British government, which was by far the largest employer on the island at the time. Meanwhile, the Nationalist Party was the voice of more self-sufficient and affluent classes of the population. Before World War II, much of the Maltese population resided in areas surrounding the two harbours either side of Valletta. The working class was mostly situated in the Grand Harbour area, next to the Cospicua dry docks. Meanwhile, on the Marsamxet side, one would have found the more affluent classes, living in posh, picturesque locations which were already popular with the British, such as Guardamanga, where none other than Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II herself, resided. World War II brought about the first wave of migration. Richer classes, typically nationalists, could afford to move away from the perils of Axis bombardments targeting the Grand Harbour to safer, more rural locations such as Mostar and Melilla. The second migration wave was a result of the 1950s population growth. Census data shows that couples typically chose to reside in locations close to the wife's family. Furthermore, in the absence of accessible means of personal transportation, locations in the proximity to the place of work were preferable. It is of no surprise, therefore, that localities such as Paula, Vgura, Zabar, and Zaytoun were natural choices for couples who, understandably, wanted to leave behind the war-devastated Cotonera. As these couples moved out, they carried along their traditionally Labour allegiances. Unlike Cotonera, the Marsamxet area did not suffer the same level of wartime destruction. Nevertheless, newlyweds from this part of the island were also moving out to localities such as San Juan and Atart. Not only were these localities more affordable alternatives to the very costly Slima residences, but thanks to already established British settlements, they still retained some of the familiar Slima character. While these migration patterns were taking place, the two main political parties were busy forging important alliances, pushing smaller parties into oblivion. The Labour Party formed an alliance with the General Workers' Union, cementing the vote of dockyard and civil service families. It is no coincidence that during this time, we see the Labour Party pushing proposals such as integration with Britain as part of their attempts to build stronger economic ties between the British government and Malta. Meanwhile, fearing the rise of the Anglican Church in Malta, the Catholic Church saw the already anti-British Nationalist Party as a natural political ally. This helped the PN gain new inroads with rural communities such as Sijiwi and much of Gozo. Meanwhile, poverty and destruction persisted in the Cotonera area. To address this, Labour administrations started building housing estates all over the island, giving rise to Labour Party voters migrating to localities beyond the outer harbour area, such as Ormi, which had not previously been common destinations for Cotonera residents. With families and friends being the strongest agents of political socialisation, it is no wonder that these political frontiers remain with us to this day. However, the 2013 and 2017 general elections may have shown signs of a trend in decline, with young couples now migrating to all parts of the island, and the number of floating voters on the rise.
So that was the 90s, where Labour and nationalist divide was very, very clear. When in 2003 a referendum was held, the question was, should we join the EU? And the reason for joining the EU is a matter of to prevent the local government of becoming an extreme in management, in governance, to make sure that there is someone who's always over-checking and that the Maltese citizens have access to equal rights. This has come because of both in the 60s and the 70s, there was a state of high alert of almost a civil war in Malta, where Maltese were against each other. Either you were Labour or you were nationalist. Luckily, by the 80s and the 90s and today, especially by joining the EU, this is a very different scenario that we're living in. You don't have that firm, staunch belief that's almost seeing the political parties like a religious order. There are some people, and I won't say a small percentage, it will be much more higher than that, who are staunch nationalists or Labourites, but you know, everyone to their own. At least today, we can discuss and say things even against the belief of the family party system. Hence, to pull out of that scenario, the idea was, at the time, my generation was, you know what, I'm really fed up with this Labour or nationalist, anti-Labourist, anti-nationalist mentality. So by joining the EU, the idea was to try and remove that obsession with political party. And that's why I tell you guys it's going to be interesting in 10, 15 years when your children start to have the right to vote. If they're influenced by Maltese politics, I don't know. But again, we don't know. Okay? We just don't know. Now, Malta in the EU has had 20 years of success. Overall, it's been successful, although recently, due to the conflicts in Ukraine and world politics and certain political agendas which have been forced onto us, like the gender issue, etc., there are many people starting to see in hindsight maybe the EU is not what it was set out to be anymore. Of course, again, it depends. If you're receiving a salary within the EU Parliament, you are going to be pro-EU. If you are suffering from it, you're not. It's always that kind of agenda. The matter of the fact is that the president of the EU is Roberta Metsola. She's Maltese.
Malta għawdex 20 sena fl-Unjoni Ewropea.
Donna, xi tfisser l-Unjoni Ewropea għalik?
Roberta, jiena għandi 20 sena. Lil Malta nafa biss fl-Unjoni Ewropea. Mhux se ngħid li l-ġenerazzjoni tiegħi toħodha for granted, però ma naħsibx li nafu biżejjed kif inhi Malta mingħajr l-opportunitajiet li tipprovdi l-Unjoni Ewropea.
Jiena nifmek Donna għandi 4 tfal, subien kollha iżgħar minnek huma kollha twildu meta Malta kienet diġà fl-Unjoni Ewropea. Imma tajjeb li aħna u resqin lejn l-20 anniversarju minn mindu Malta saret membru li nirriflettu ftit u tajjeb li aħna infakru nitkellmu mal-ġenerazzjoni tiegħek dwar x'għamilna. 20 sen ilu kienet battalja kbira biex aħna tħallna. Imma aħna dejjem arafna li postna kien fiċ-ċentru tal-Unjoni Ewropea għaliex kien hemm iżjed opportunitajiet, iżjed fondi, kwalità ta' ħajja aħjar, opportunitajiet mhux biss ta' studju imma ta' xogħol li tista' tmur minn pajjiż għal ieħor mingħajr ma jkollok problemi. Kemm rajna f'dawn l-20 sena li tant illum meta nħarsu madwarna, naħseb kulħadd jaraf li dik id-deċiżjoni mhux kienet tajba biss imma kienet l-unika waħda li stajna nieħdu.
Is-sħubija ta' Malta fl-Unjoni Ewropea ġabet magħha bidla l-aħjar f'pajjiżna u għall-poplu Malti wawċi. Infrastruttura ġdida u moderna, opportunitajiet ta' studju, taħriġ u xogħol, żvilupp ekonomiku u soċjali, għajnuna fi żminijiet internazzjonali ta' taqlib ekonomiku, munita waħda, stabbiltà, vjaġġar faċli, swieq ekonomiċi ġodda, skemi finanzjarji għas-sidin tan-negozju u l-SMEs, ambjenti sbaħ u aktar nadif. Is-sħubija ta' Malta fl-Unjoni Ewropea ġabet magħha bidla l-aħjar, progress għal kull Malti u Maltija, għal kull Awċi u Awċija.
Waħda mix-xewqat tiegħi hi li jiena nistudja imur pajjiżi oħra u li nġib lura l-esperjenzi li kolli barra minn Malta lura f'pajjiżna. Għandi ħbieb li marru Erasmus pereżempju.
Dik hija xi ħaġa waħda mill-programmi li sbaħ li għandna fl-Unjoni Ewropea. Jiena meta kont għadni studenta bħalek illum kont mort Franza u kont taraf x'inhuma l-opportunitajiet. L-Unjoni Ewropea tagħti liż-żgħażagħ l-opportunità li jistudjaw barra, li jaħdmu barra, li inti tkun tista' wara li tallimt tiġi lura Malta u dak li tallimt inti tużah hawnhekk. Dik hija l-isbaħ ħaġa dwar l-Unjoni Ewropea.
Roberta, inti eżempju ċar tas-suċċess li għamlet Malta fl-Unjoni Ewropea. Għamiltna kburin, poġġejt isimna fuq il-mappa tad-dinja u rejtna li id-daqs ta' pajjiżna m'għandux illimitana mill-opportunitajiet.
Ix-xogħol tiegħi mhux huwa suċċess għalija, imma suċċess għal-Maltin u l-Awċin kollha. U dak id-dover tiegħi li jiena naħdem kuljum fir-rwol li għandi llum biex nagħti lura lil dawk il-Maltin u l-Awċin li ġew qabilna li tant ħadmu għalina biex dawk li jiġu warajna ikunu jistgħu jirtu dak kollu li għamilna għalihom.
Libertà, ugwaljanza, opportunità, futur, ġustizzja, demokrazija, valuri, għaqda, ispirazzjoni, bidla, solidarjetà, innovazzjoni, eċċellenza, viżjoni, tama, tmexxija.
20 sena ilu bdejna din il-mixja flimkien. Għamilna passi kbar il-qoddim, imma tbaqalna ħafna x'nagħmlu. Riżultati x'niksbu, suċċessi li nilħqu. Ejjew naħdmu biex ikollna iżjed opportunitajiet u nkomplu nwettqu l-ambizzjonijiet tagħna flimkien bħala Maltin u Awċin fl-Ewropa.
Now this video is rather long, 17 minutes, so I'm just going to share it with you in the chat so you can watch it in your own time. Again, it's to give you access to what happened. It didn't share. Let me try the chat again. That's weird. Okay, let me try another chat. I'll share this when I can. I don't know why it's not posting. Okay, now it's working. No, it's not working. Wrong thing. Delete. Let me try again. Copy video. Paste. There you go. All right. It gives you hindsight and understanding the subconscious, emotional history that drives our, I wouldn't say thinking process, logical thinking process today, but you start to understand the habits and the customs and the behaviors.
So now.
What's interesting is that by joining the EU, we have our own EU currency. So the 1 penny, 1 cent, 2 cent, 5 cent represent Neolithic Malta. 10, 20, 50 cent represent Republic Malta. And then, of course, the famous Maltese cross that was created by the Order of St. John, but known internationally as the Maltese cross on the €1, €2. Now, here is the current situation of the political scenario. So, when we had the referendum in 2003 to decide, are we going to be part of the EU or not? The crazy thing is that the Nationalist Party was in favor of joining the EU, whereas the Labour Party, Socialist Party, was not. Which goes against all the principles of politics, because if you're a nationalist, you do not want to give up your sovereignty, your right to rule, to govern without a superior big brother in a way. Whereas if you are a socialist, a Labourite, you believe in the EU because it provides access to economies where you can find future employment elsewhere. That's the logic of politics. However, in Malta, nationalists were pro, Labour was against. But what is the situation today? What you find is that Labour, especially from 2013 onwards, Labour was no longer pro the worker, because even the worker mentality was no longer, I need a job, I'm just without, I need security of employment. Today, working mentality is also, in a way, you negotiate with the company about your salaries and your conditions. And what the Labour mentality is today is that it's not pro-worker, it's more listen, we need to have a strong economy. How can you have that? By having businesses that are doing very well. What's the benefit? That they create working employments, opportunities. So the mentality of the Labour has shifted, and Nationalist Party is no longer pro-businessmen. It's not against, it's moving more towards quality of lifestyle and political ideology. So there has been a shift on the political front and the political ideologies of the two parties from the 1950s and today.
U biex tissejjaħ elezzjoni ġenerali.
In case you haven't heard, Maltese people take elections very seriously. An intense partisanship exists, and this can be seen by the high voter turnout at elections, which typically dwarfs the EU average. Up until the 1960s, the Maltese political landscape was dotted with smaller political parties. None of them lasted for more than a few years, and by 1971, only two major parties remained, the Nationalist Party and the Labour Party. They have remained top dogs since, polling over 98% in the 2017 general election. Over the years, both major parties have left an indelible mark on the national fabric. The two main parties used to go tooth and nail against one another, with Labour's identity as a workers' party clearly distinct from the Nationalists' more affluent, business-friendly image.
Il-poplu Malti għadu u jibqa' wara l-moviment tal-ħaddiema.
But over the years, have the Labour Party and the Nationalist Party become too similar?
Tagħna huwa Fil-libertà li jagħmel għażla jien fl-opinjoni tiegħi ċara bejn żewġ pożizzjonijiet kompletament differenti minn xulxin.
The Maltese electorate has observed the two parties somewhat converge on a number of major policies. The debate on the fundamental principles underlying the democratic process has been settled. The parties are also seemingly singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to a host of other major issues. Even the stick with which parties beat each other has seemingly become the same. You would be forgiven if you thought that this text was in a recent electoral campaign by the nationalists, but they are actually from the Labour Party's manifesto way back in 1996. It seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same. But why? Let's take a look at what in politics is known as the left-right political spectrum. During the French Revolution of 1789, members of the National Assembly divided into supporters of the king to the president's right and supporters of the revolution to his left. The term has evolved. The left later on became associated with parties seeking to safeguard workers' rights, allied with liberal parties. To the right, Christian democratic parties were organised by Catholics who saw liberalism as a threat to traditional values. In Malta, the Labour Party was typically leaning more toward the left and the nationalists towards the right. Now, each of our individual beliefs puts us somewhere on this political spectrum. Different societies tend to have different views towards political issues, but the belief of the majority of voters typically lies somewhere around the middle of the spectrum. It makes more sense for parties to base their principles closer towards the middle, rather than either end of the spectrum, because logically, their message will resonate with more people, resulting in a larger share of votes. In political theory, this is called the median voter theorem. The principles of the median voter can vary across different countries. Traditionally, the American median voter leans more towards the right, being generally against government participation in the economy and more inclined towards individual liberties.
All voters said they were uncomfortable with a socialist candidate for president.
Over the years, the two main Maltese parties have moved more towards the centre of the political spectrum, such that the distinction between the fundamental principles between the two parties is not as clear as it once was, a concept which, up until a couple of decades ago, seemed unfathomable. Partisan battles are no longer fought on fundamental principles, but specific, hotly debated issues have become the new battleground. The upcoming election will probably not be too different, with parties going tit for tat with each other. But you can be sure that once the smoke clears, voters may realise that the two parties are more alike than they care to think.
So here we are today in the aspects of what we understand in Maltese politics. So when you look at the population count, all right, this statistic was held in 2021. So when you look over 1,000 years, 991 AD, about 20,000 people, it drops after the Great Siege, and then you can see here what I mean by the zenith of Maltese culture, because from 1582 all the way to 1741 there's a huge increase in population growth. If the economy is doing well, the people are really happy, you know, people are making more babies, there's more security, there's more food, there's economic growth, family growth, social development, and it pretty much remains the same from 1741 throughout. 1842, then you start to see increase again. Society is advancing despite the challenges. And then we find in 2011, 417, and just 10 years later, increase by 90,000, 80,000. And if you look at the statistics today, 2025, we're at about 600, 650,000 people living on this little island. That's why traffic has become a nightmare. Rubbish is a problem. Of course, new times, new agendas, new issues, new challenges. List of public holidays in Malta. All right, 1st of January, New Year's Day. Everyone knows about it. That's international. Beginning of the new year. 10th February, St. Paul's. 19th March, Feast of St. Joseph. 31st, Freedom Day, when the British left for good. 15th April, it's Good Friday, religion. 1st of May, International Workers' Day. 7th June, 7 Junio, the killing of 4 Maltese in the riot, in the protests held in Valletta. 29 June, Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. 15th August, Feast of the Assumption, also known as Feast of the Arrival of the Convoy to Santa Maria, the Operation Pedestal. 8 September, Victory Day, associated with the Great Siege. 21st September, Independence Day. 8 December, Immaculate Conception, religion. 13 December, Republic Day. 25th December, Christmas Day. So when you look at task number 2, with all the history that we have, don't tell me you can't find something. There's a village, in every village there are 2 to 3 churches. Take that as a starting point if you have to. You have so many aspects in landmarks in Malta, Roman, Phoenician, Greek, Egyptian, Arab, the Normans, Aragonese not so much, but with the Aragonese in the Order of St. John, the Maltese Falcon, and the movie, the Maltese Falcon, the Great Siege, what comes after every little place in Valletta, around the islands, the aqueducts, the fortifications. Then you have the French, then you have the British, and on and on and on. You have technologies through the Industrial Revolution, the train, the automobile. You can also do, if you want, task number 2 on Malta bus station and its history, the old buses, for example. Okay? Be creative with task number 2. Don't be limited. Have fun with it. All right? When you start to realize that things, then you start to think about your own culture. And who can represent your culture? Maltese? No, you can. So then, after you finish I Belong, I hope I inspire you to learn more about Maltese culture, your own culture, and learn about how to present it, how to talk about it. That's the hidden agenda behind this course, coming from me at least.